All right, so, Bismillah. So the thing is today we're going to speak about the ulama and modernity. And so one of the things I'm going to do today in this week's class or lesson, in the hour that we have, is I want to sort of like give you a mental imagination or a picture of what are the ulama, which sounds very strange because we take it for granted that we know who the ulama are. But from my time living in Turkey and speaking to people of a younger generation, one of the things that I have found is there is a particular disconnect of understanding exactly what this institution is. Now, I call them a, this Turkey is going to institute, missing. I call them a meta-institution. Tamam. Now, the reason why I call them a meta-institution, this is something that I have started developing in my own mind as a way of trying to explain the institution of the ulama, is because they are not simply an institution. They are bigger than that. The idea of being meta means above in that sense, okay? It means it's something which is large and it encompasses everything. So an example, just for you to understand. Allah, or Allah Ta'ala, is a meta. He's meta. He's above everything, beyond it. So to understand, you have to understand like this. The cosmos is meta. We are beings in this cosmos, not just in this country, in this city, in this planet, but in the cosmos. The idea of using the word meta is to help you understand that this is something which is larger than just something like an institution. Okay, the ummah, the idea of the ummah is meta, because it transcends time and it transcends space, meaning it's not restricted to one time. The ummah is not just of the ummah of today. We have an ummah that came before us. We have an ummah that's going to come after us. In that sense, the idea is to think that it is meta. It goes beyond time and then it goes beyond space. The ummah is not restricted to one place. Even if you had a khilaf or khilafat, there's ummah within it, then there's ummah outside of it. So the ummah in that sense transcends that. One of the institutions that I talk about that transcends that then is the ulama. The ulama as the guardians of the faith, as we call them in English, they transcend just like the ummah transcends, in that sense, time and space. They are a meta-institution. I want you to remember that, because throughout the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be highlighting this point. This is something which is missing in the sort of like imagination or the conceptualization in Western academia, and I think it's problematic. I think this is one of the problems that Western academia has. It doesn't quite grasp what the ulama are. The ulama are often referred to in comparison to Judeo-Christian tradition, and in reality they are not the same. Okay, they are not the same. And I'm going to try to explain why they are not the same. For example, so, Bismillah, the first thing that I want you to think of, and Anna who's in the front, you know this already because I've done it in class, but it's good to see you here. Aqidah, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm deliberately going to use the Islamic terminology. There's a reason for that, because some words are just untranslatable. I will translate them, but I'm just helping you understand that while I am translating them, these translations are sloppy. They're not really true or accurate translations. They're not tight, but they're the best translations we can give in the English medium. So, which would say? The Aqidah is your creed, okay? In that sense, Aqidah. Now, I've said this before, that when we do our Shahada in Islam, the Shahada is intrinsic in the Shahada. The word Ashhadu, Shahada, is the idea that it is something that you know. So you're saying your Shahada from a perspective of knowing. That means that you have ilm, okay? And the Shahada requires from you, if you know, that you know with certainty. How do we know the idea of certainty? Because we say La ilaha. We start with La, a negation. Negation is often certain. Do you want tea? No. Are you happy? No. Do you like Yakub Hajar? No. Right? In that context. So we know that this is an issue of certainty. And we say La ilaha illallah. We don't say there is no God but Allah. I mean, there's no God but God. We say there is nothing worthy of worship but Allah Ta'ala. The word is not worship per se, but the word is also not God. Ilah here doesn't simply mean God. It means any form of superiority. All right? Now, the point here is that we're being asked to know, regarding our Aqidah, with knowledge of who is Allah and what came before us. And Allah has come before us. And then there's another part of your shahada, wa and ashhadu, another testimony. Ashhadu anna Muhammadin. So we're doubling down. And Muhammad now, the messenger of Allah, once again, is important for Muslims in regards to our aqidah. So we now need to know who is Muhammad, Rasul Sallam. And abduhu, so he is the slave of Allah Ta'ala. But abduhu, the word ibadah, is the same root word. It means to be an abd means the one who worships. What do you worship? You worship Allah in that context, right? So not only do you need to know who Allah is, you need to know what is not Allah. You need to know what came before you. You need to know who is Muhammad Rasul Sallam, and you need to know your purpose, which is abduhu, to worship. And then how do you worship? Wa Rasulu. The Rasul part is what? That he brought something to communicate with in regards to insan, human beings. The forms of communication he brought was the Quran and the Sunnah, right? But not only that, the notion of Rasulu also indicates that he's a Rasul, and here maybe not for maybe, but it's not, maybe some people will argue, not in the Shahada, but it is clear to some degree for those of us who know that he is the last Rasul. In that sense, he's a Nabi and a Rasul, which means there were Nabis and Rasuls before him, which means he's a continuation of a message that was being brought down. And that's your Aqidah in Islam, right? That's the basis that you come from. The Ulama, the job of the Ulama is that they are people who reflect this Aqidah just like we do as Muslims. And the fact that in this Shahada there is an element or an aspect that you must know, it means that ilm is necessary here. All right. Now, the ulama are the guardians of the faith, which means they are the people who continue wa Rasul. They continue that message. This is important to understand. Now, we as Muslims are interesting because we say our shahada verbally. We say, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. And I explained to my friends, because I watched The Mandalorian and Star Wars and so forth. And in The Mandalorian, they'll say, this is the way. It's a verbalization of their creed, their aqidah, their shahada. May the force be with you. Assalamu alaikum. And so forth, right? So what you can see is that George Lucas has understood something, which is that in particular cultures, that there is a need to verbalize, to say your aqidah. So it is not just something you believe in, it's something you must say to internalize. Anyway, the next part then is ilm, which loosely is knowledge. Knowledge. Now ilm here once again is not knowledge. Okay, knowledge is a very cheap understanding of what ilm is. But what I'm trying to explain to you, those of us who are Muslim and those of us who understand, being in a Muslim environment, is that there is an expectation in this context of ilm. Your ilm comes from your aqidah. Okay, your ilm is based on the aqidah. The aqidah, the creed itself, drives the ilm that you are learning. So it drives the way you see the world. The way that you see the world is from the perspective that you testify that there is nothing superior apart from Allah Ta'ala, which is something which is rejected in the West in that context. That Rasul Sallam is the messenger of Allah, which is rejected in the West. That you are people of ibadah, abduhu, so your worldview is ubudiyah. And that wa Rasulu, Quran and Sunnah. So that's your aqidah, so your ilm is taken from that. So what we can say then, that in other civilizations, this is not the aqidah. The aqidah is something different. So your ilm, the knowledge that you are taking, is driven by this. That's important for you to understand, because the ulama, now going to them, are practitioners of this ilm. They are people who give this ilm. That's their job. And so if you look at the word ulama and ilm, the root word is the same, right? In that sense. So we're going to get to the ulama in a second. So now the next part is well fused. See this? Okay. The next part is deen. Okay. The ilm then shapes the deen. You can only understand your deen if you understand the ilm that pertains to that deen. Without not knowing that ilm, your understanding of deen is deficient. You have a weakness in your understanding of the deen. Now, a lot of people, once again, they would characterize the word deen as religion, and religion is not helpful here. Okay? Islam is more than just a religion. And it's because people see Islam as religion in this country more specifically, then they compartmentalize Islam as being simply religion, simply matters of worship, simply matters of hijab, simply matters of going to the masjid and jami and the diyanet and so forth. The point I'm trying to make to you here is if we look at the word deen as worldview, then it becomes more encompassing. And then the last point. This is Turkey. Siyaset. Your politics then is then driven by your worldview. Okay, your worldview shapes your politics, and whatever politics you subscribe to, whatever politics you belong to, whatever politics you believe in, is driven by that worldview. Now, one of the interesting things I want to show you, or maybe I can stand up, is that these all influence each other. The politics clearly has an impact on your worldview, and your worldview can clearly impact the ilm that you understand. An example, LGBT. LGBT narratives, it's a worldview that impacts the ilm in the way that you see gender. It's not ilm that impacts the worldview. It used to be, but it's changing because this worldview is ideological now. And the politics is driving this, which drives this. Okay, now, what we're saying is that ilm shapes your worldview, and these are interconnected, interchangeable. All right? So I'm not saying that it's a linear process. I've just done a linear process because I'm using Microsoft Word. But the point I'm trying to make to you here then is, as a way of understanding the Islamic sort of like objective of who the ulama are, then this is how you would see the world. Your aqidah, your basis, your creed, it gives you meaning in terms of your existence, in terms of who you are. We have a belief in terms of, well, not even belief, it's yaqeen, in terms of this life and the next life. That drives the ilm, the knowledge that we attain and learn in regards to this life and the next life. That shapes our worldview in the way that we place ourselves in the world that we live in the way that we look at humanity, in the way that we place ourselves regarding the cosmos, and it is from that our politics is established. Okay? Now, obviously, we nowadays live in a secular nation state, so some people might object to the political part, but nonetheless, this is the point I'm trying to make to you in regards to the 19th, 20th century when we're talking about the Ottoman Ulema and modernity. Right. Are we okay so far? Yes, I'm going at a good pace, alhamdulillah. All right, so now then, as I said, ilm, which you have ulama, and the ulama. All right, so this is now another list of terminologies I'm giving you. So the ulama are the physical representation, the embodiment of that ilm. Okay, the ulama are the practitioners of that ilm. In that sense, they are the meta-institution. If ilm is everywhere and drives your worldview, if ilm is shaped by your aqidah, then the practitioners of that ilm are also driving that worldview. Not only are they shaping your deen worldview, they're shaping your politics. They don't have to be political or politicians, but they're shaping it from the fact where the ilm is coming from. And this is important to understand that. So the ulama, and I wrote the word amal here, it's important, the word amal meaning actions. It's not just you're learning ilm for the sake of knowing, it's for the sake of practicing, right? This is why then you need a murabbi. So people you can see who are practicing these actions. It's necessary. When I was growing up, a young man, my mum and dad got divorced when I was very young. It's going to go on YouTube now. There you go. But I had people in my life who I looked up to. I needed to know how to be a young man. I needed to know how to be a good Muslim. I needed to know how to be a Muslim. And you look at the way that specific individuals of ilm were practicing amal. You needed to see it. The absence of that in society, the absence of that in our community, the absence of that in our lives and in our family leads to a deficiency within the Muslim community. Once again, I'm making this point because in Turkey there is an absence of this generally on a scale which is visible. Okay, it's not visible. It might be there, but it's not visible, tangibly visible, and it needs to be to some degree in that sense. So in my household, if you came to my house, you will see I have the names of Allah and Rasul Sallam and so forth calligraphy in my house. There's a reason for that. It's visible. I can see it. I know Allah Ta'ala exists. I pray 5 times a day. I believe. I have aqidah. But still, it's nice to have the visible symbols that I can see. It reminds me of that. And human beings need that. Human beings are not devoid of that visibility. So it's necessary for human beings to know, younger people in particular, to know what it means to not only be a Muslim, but a good Muslim. What it means to exist in this cosmos, what it means to have responsibility. You can't only be told that. You have to live it. You have to experience it. You have to see it. And this is what the ulama were doing as a meta-institution in the Ottoman period. So the problem we have is we see the ulama, unfortunately, from the Western perspective, we've internalized this as individuals. Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Ghazali, Abu Hanifa. We see them as people, as these individuals. What I'm trying to remind you is, I'm not interested in the individuals here because I'm talking about the Ottoman period. I'm talking about them as a meta-institution. They need to exist as a meta-institution. The block. Individuals will make mistakes here and there. Individuals will have a deficiency in the ilm here and there. Individuals may write great works and not so great works. And individuals may commit crimes and atrocities against Muslims and non-Muslims, even if they are ulama. But the institution, the meta-institution, as a paradigm, in that sense, as a matrix, if we can say, will always hold each other to account because the meta-institution is based on the aqidah, la ilaha illallah. Okay? So this is the idea of the ulama. So I want you to understand that. I want you to see them as a unit. Because a lot of the times, one of the things that people find difficult regarding late Ottoman history is they keep telling me, give me some names of some ulama, some people, because they become accustomed to individuals. And I said, it's not important what their names are. Understand how they operated as a meta-institution. One of the reasons maybe why we have a deficiency in the way we understand the late Ottoman ulama in particular is because they operated, because they were working towards state building so often, that they became accustomed to building the state. And to one degree, individuals were not writing as many works. They didn't have the luxury to do that. And that they were working towards the machinery of what it means to be mixing with people all the time. I disagree with that point, however. I do believe they were writing books. I mean, I just picked up one book today here by one of the Shaykh al-Islam. This is a nice volume. So what it indicates also is that we have a disconnect and a deficiency in reading the works of the Ottoman ulama for various reasons. All right, so how do we see them then? One of the things that I want you to then understand now is we're talking about the word ilmi. Let me use the right eye. Come on, man. I can do better than this in Turkish. There you go. All right, it's the ilmiya, all right? The ilmiya system then is an institution, a meta-institution, that are the institutions from which the ulama come from, all right? This is a very unique Ottoman thing now. When I would argue that after Fatih's conquest of Constantinople, which then became Istanbul, in that sense, one of the things that you start to see is that when the Ottomans are state building, what they are developing from their worldview, which is the worldview of Islam, the need to have institutions that represent that worldview so that Islam can be practiced. What we learn from very early on then, from the Ottoman Ghazal, from Osman and Orhan Ghazi, is the ulama were there from the beginning. Okay? It's really sad for me when I read like the Ghazi thesis and so forth, trying to make an argument whether the early Ottomans were Muslim or not. And that's based on the argument of how you look at the word Ghazw and Ghazi, right? With liberal academics making the case that they were just going for booty, land, extension, and more religious academics say no, they were going for jihad, fi sabilillah, and whatnot. But what's interesting, or what's even more interesting, is when we see the early Ottomans, we see the ulama, they exist. Okay, if the ulama exist, what's going on here? And they, as an institution, are less studied when we do Ottoman studies because we are sultanic-centered. We're obsessed with the sultans. We want to know what the people at the top did. Okay, we call this the great man syndrome. Okay, obsessed with people of power and not interested in anything else. Even in this country, there's an obsession with the person who's in power, and we don't seem to analyze the institutions that exist in Turkish society and state as a way of understanding this devlet better. All right, so the Ilmiya class then, they were part of power in which we had the Ilmiya. Oh no, we can do this. We can, come on, man. So these were the three main institutions, and I'm loosely defining them in regards to what the Ottoman devlet was about in terms of institutions of power, which is the Ilmiya, the Mulkiya, and the Askariya, right? So we have the military class, which is the Askariya, the Mulkiya class, which is the executive class, which could be the Padishah, the Grand Viziers, the Ayan, and whatnot. And then we have the Ilmiya, which is the ulama class. And these were the three main institutions in the way that the state itself was configured in the early Ottoman period, and it starts to adjust and evolve in the latter Ottoman period in that context. We're doing okay for time. All right. So one of the things that we see within the Ilmiya then is the establishment of what what we would say is education, judiciary, and fatwa culture. So the three main important things regarding the ilmi system within the Ottoman domains is the education system, which is the madrasa, so the judiciary system, which is the legal system, and then fatwa culture, okay? But that's not it. The reason why I say they are a meta-institution is because the ulama did your nikah, the ulama did your janaza. Somebody would knock on the alim's door and say, hey, am I allowed to eat this cheese? Somebody would say, hey, you know, they would ask all sorts of questions. The imams at the jami, the teachers in the school, the lawyers, giving fatwas for society, giving fatwas to remove the padishah. The point I'm making, when there's a war, the ulama are encouraging the soldiers to fight. When the soldiers die, they do their janazas for that. So it's a constant. The point I'm trying to make is how deeply ingrained they were in the Ottoman system. And the reason why you need to understand that is because in week 4, when we talk about how the Turkish Republic removed the ulama, you've got to understand how this meta-institution was removed from the Turkish Republic. And in that sense, the Turkish Republic is very different from the late Ottoman period, because there's a removal of a main, what I would call meta-institution, which was deeply ingrained in Ottoman society. Now, as I said, it's not just their institutions and what they did then. It's also the way they dressed. Uniform, it matters. It matters the way you dress. It matters the way you look, okay? So I'm not wearing a uniform, of course, because I'm kind of cool. But what you see is that when I was watching a video of Sheikh Buti last night, and it was intriguing for me because he was dressed in a particular way, sitting at his table in a jami, in a mosque. Everybody was sitting in a room. The room was quiet, and that uniform mattered. The visibility of him sitting there mattered. To see people walking down the street who look this way mattered. It gives you an indication of Islam's physical presence as soft power around you in that context. So in that sense, it's not just when people say, okay, we have ulama in Turkey, so what are you saying, Yakub Ahmedin? I say, yes, I agree with you, but the visibility in any Muslim society is necessary, because if the visibility is not there, then people forget. People have a tendency of forgetting, because that's just the nature of human beings. Human beings forget, okay, in that sense. So then what are the roles that these people had? They were mudarris, they were imams, they were naibs, they were qadis, they were muftis, they were mujtahids. Okay, so to be an alim then, or the point I'm trying to help you understand then, is what does it mean then to be part of this ulama class, okay? And so this is what I want you to consider and think about, because in this country in particular, we don't have that. And this is the problem that we face sometimes, is because we don't have it, it's hard to imagine it. We do have them in other Muslim societies, but also in other Muslim societies, they are curtailed, controlled, manipulated, and so forth. There's a restriction taking place. In Saudi Arabia right now, you see many of the ulama being arrested, and so forth. In Syria, there was a war, and whatnot, okay? Now, people will make the argument that the ulama should not be political. We are all political. If you have an opinion, you're political, okay? So the idea that the ulama should not be political doesn't make sense. But what we're saying here is that some people, or some members of the ulama would be more political than others. The way that they would exercise their politics is some would physically have positions of power where they can influence, and others, just via ilm, could influence and shape society. Even being apolitical is a political position, by the way. Because by giving ilm that shapes your worldview, you're changing the world that you exist in, okay? Now, today, I'll give you an example. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Now, if that was in the Muslim context, you would have straight away turn to the ulama and go, what's the score here? What do we do, right? It's natural. People ask me, are there fatwas on such and such? Is there fatwas on the print press? Is there fatwas on coffee? Is there fatwas of Hagia Sophia turning into a mosque? And so I was only speaking to someone today, because people say we should turn Hagia Sophia back into a church. If we do that, we might as well give Istanbul back to the Christians as well. It doesn't make sense when you're listening to what people are saying in that sense, right? So the point I'm trying to make to you is that how deeply ingrained a lot of this is in regards to politics and so forth. And you need to understand that it's bigger than how I feel or what it means to me. Now, why is that? Because the Quran as a book doesn't speak to only you as individuals. The Quran speaks to us as the collective. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. It's plural, it's collective. It's not about me in terms of needing guidance. It's us. in that sense. So Allah speaks to us as the collective, and there's a recognition then that there is an us within us, and that's why ummah and ulama are plurals. They're not singular, because we are a communal-based people. All right, so I wanted you to understand that in regards to understanding the ulama to some degree. Now let's go into modernity. Okay, now the problem I have with modernity is, I'm going to be pretty honest with you, I don't know what that is. We use it a lot. As academics, we use this fluffy word, modernity. We're in the modern period. This is modern leshme, falan, falan, falan. But in reality, one of the things that you learn very quickly as an academic is that the word modernity is very malleable. It changes shape and it moves and so forth. And I'm not quite sure what people say when they say, we don't want modernity anymore, or I'm not modern, and so forth. What you start to realize is that in the English medium, this description of the word modernity is a narrative. Okay, now the issue with this narrative is, or the problem we have with this narrative, is that there is something intrinsic within this narrative, which is that it's driven by something which is Eurocentric. To be modern, the idea to be modern, is to be progressive. To be progressive, to some degree, is to be Western, which was initially Western European, now it's Western. And that's what it means to be progressive. And we saw this in the case of Ukraine, right? So in the case of Ukraine, so many reporters turned around and said, they are like us, they are white, they are civilized, they are progressive, they watch Netflix and they watch Instagram. What are you talking about? Actually, when they said those stuff, I really felt like, oh yeah, we shouldn't have Netflix and Instagram, but we do. And so one of the things you realize is how the idea or the notion of what it means to be modern is shaped. And when my family members came to Istanbul, they were very upset when I came to Istanbul. My parents in particular felt that we left our countries to give you a better life, not for you to go backwards, because I'm from London, back to the Muslim world. But then when they came to visit me, they said, oh, Istanbul's quite modern, which was interesting for me. And I asked them, what do you mean it's modern? So they have metro, and they have buses and stuff. And the world has changed, Mum and Dad. But I understand what they were thinking. They were shaped by this worldview. This worldview was shaping them in thinking. The ilm that they were having in England, the knowledge, was telling them that to be progressive, to be modern, there is a problem regarding modernity in Islam somewhere. Now here's the issue with modernity in of itself as an idea, okay? And as I said, the problem with it is there is a modernity, there is a pre-modernity, and then modernity. So the first thing it does is it splits time. There's a world before modernity, and then there's a world after modernity. And so what we have become, which is unparalleled in human history, is we become fixated in then placing ourselves in this timeline. A world before us and a world after us in that context. And not only that, modernity then also shapes space. As I said, there is an assumption the West is modern and the non-West is not modern, okay, in that context. Now, some people will add the aspect of race in it, in that context. That's another argument for another day. But, so the idea is what is modernity then? And so one of the problems we have is language. Language, we have a huge problem with language in the way that we describe ourselves and how we live in it. Progress, what is progress? If I said to you, alhamdulillah, young Muslims, all the Muslims I'm meeting now are praying 5 times a day. That's progress. That would not be accepted as progress. That's not what we mean by progress here. So alhamdulillah, we've come a long way. And, I know a lot more people who have memorized Quran. That's not progress. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is when we go back in time and we're looking at data such as education. So often I get Muslims saying to me, the Muslims were illiterate in the past. Look at the literacy rates. That's not progress. And then I said to them, let me see the data. What is the data from the madrasa education? What is the data from the esnaf education? What is the data from the military establishment? 0. The way that they see education is Western schools. So for them, that's how progress is driven. Now, Muslim societies, and I've said this on so many occasions, were both oral and written societies. The Quran is an oral and written book. It's a book that we wrote, and it's a book that we recited. I've said this on so many occasions. When Rasul Sallam meets Jibreel alayhi salam, Iqra here, we've said it on many occasions, there is nothing that's been written on a cave for him to read. Okay, it means recite and it means to understand. Rasul Sallam is memorizing something. He's memorizing oral transmission. Oral transmission is a strong component of Muslim civilization. Many Muslims didn't have to know how to read and write, because you don't need to know how to read and write to understand. They knew how to listen. They knew how to speak. They knew how to debate. This is part of the Ulumi tradition, by the way. And one of the things that we're going to see in the 19th century regarding modernity in particular is the contestation between the written form and the oral form. There is a contestation taking place between these two forms. Print press, print media changes the way we do Islam to some degree, because the written form is now competing with the oral form. The Majalle, for example. The Majalle gives you the permission to print laws into books that can be distributed across the empire. Now you no longer need a person who memorizes and uses his mind. He can just pull out a book, open it, put it back. In fact, the Majalle was interesting because in Lebanon, for example, you had judges who were not even Muslim, who could apply it. Pull out the book, the Majalle, the law says this, close it, put it back. That's the Sharia for you, off you go. Right? You see a contestation between the written form and the oral form in this sense. The written form. The Quran was written by hand, by the Hattat. This is why my friend Bilal, and he's writing his alifs for 20 minutes on, and he's not allowed to make a mistake. Why? Because if you made a mistake writing the Quran by hand, you've made a mistake writing Quran. Right? And you start again, rub it out. It's difficult. So they took their time. They lost that because we're printing them now. Okay? Everybody has a mushaf in their house, collecting dust in a corner somewhere. But in the past, only the privileged people had mushafs. Most people memorized them if they could. So how did they interact with the Quran? They went to the jami. The imam would recite Quran to them. They would see the calligraphy written in particular places. They would send their children, somebody memorize the Quran so that it's in our house, so that I can hear it. They would try to memorize large chunks of it. This oral transmission was important in that society. The written text changes that. Now we can print it. We don't need to memorize it. We have it in a book, and I can put it in the corner. All right? So a lot of these things, and this sounds strange, but it's similar, because people always critique the Ottomans about the printing press. But it's similar to saying, we don't need muezzins anymore. We can just play a tape. Right? We could, actually. Technically, we could do that. But the muezzins will go crazy. Like the guy outside. Could you imagine him losing his job because I can just play a tape? That does happen in parts of Turkey, by the way. I've been to parts of Turkey where you go into a mosque and there's no muezzin. There's just a tape that is pressed and so forth. Right? And it happened in Egypt, and then people went crazy. But this is the technology. The point I'm trying to make to you then is because there's a strange paradox in the minds of Muslims. On the one hand, they critique Muslim society regarding being backwards, in not being at the same level regarding printing press. They say, how comes the Muslims were not printing? How comes we didn't print fast enough? How comes we were not printing like the West? And then on the other hand, making the same, another argument by saying, how comes we're losing the oral tradition? How comes we are codifying? How comes the books are becoming printed? Well, which one do you want? Do you want the printing press? But the consequence of printing press is that you no longer need oral tradition and so forth, right? So this is the point I'm making. And what's interesting here is because Muslims in particular, but not only them, have ingrained the idea of ulama decline in the Ottoman period. They've internalized it, that the ulama were in decline. Now, the reason why this happens is because when we're talking about the ulama in the late Ottoman period, in particular, there is an emphasis on obsession. One, to look at the ulama from the nation-state narratives. The creation of the nation-states, in that sense, created an idea in which the ulama were backwards. We don't need these people, we don't want them, so forth, blah, blah, blah. A second problem is regarding the ulama, in the way that we look at them, is that to some degree, we have internalized them. The way that we've internalized them as a group is almost as if they are expendable. They are something that we can use whenever we feel free to use them. They're there on the side. And I need some religious advice and this person will give it to me. And we've internalized in our minds to some degree that the ulama are backwards, they're not intelligent, they're fanatics, and so forth, which is not the case, okay? Which is not the case. Now, in some countries like Turkey, the absence of the ulama then compounds that when you can't see them, when the visibility is not there, all right? So one of the things that we want to change then is, when we're talking about this, is the idea of modernity. Now, what does it mean to be modern? Now here what we have is you have a narrative of secularization, and we have a narrative of westernization, and then we have a narrative of modernization. And one of the questions we need to ask is, are these all the same thing? Is modernization, westernization, and secularization the same thing? And to some degree what we're finding is very difficult, is because we actually don't understand even what these terms mean. What does secularization mean to us? What does it mean to be secular? And how does it work? In the past, in Islamic law, they didn't need to define something as being secular and religious. We sort of got it. But as academics, the more we're going on in this period, we need to qualify things with names to it. So, for example, me right now, I'm not an alim. Does that mean I'm a secular education person or educator? How does it work? BİSAV, what is it, secular or is it religious? How does it work, right? And so one of the things is we created a binary, which is if it's not Islamic, it's secular. Now the word Islamic in of itself is problematic. How do we make sense of that word? I was doing a podcast, which I get very tired of, because Muslims really ask me questions that frustrate me. And the person said, how Islamic are the Ottomans? And I just like, oh, what does that mean? What are you asking me? What does that mean, how Islamic are the Ottomans? Are you asking me are they Muslim or not? He goes, well, I know they're Muslim. So what are you asking me, how Islamic are they? You can only ask me that question in English. You wouldn't ask me that question in Arabic or in Turkish, how Islamic are the Ottomans? It makes no sense, zero sense whatsoever. But in English, you'd say, how Islamic are the Ottomans? So then I said, are you making the case they're not a caliphate? Yes, that's the case. Well, Salahuddin was not a caliphate. Is he not Islamic? The Seljuks were not a caliphate. Are they not Islamic? Fatih, that wasn't a caliphate. Then maybe he's not Islamic. No, that's not what I'm asking you. Then what are you implementing the Sharia? The Sharia is what I'm after. Okay, the Ottomans were implementing the Sharia. The Seljuks were implementing the Sharia. In Pakistan, they say they implement the Sharia. So what are we saying now? No, that's not what I'm asking you. Then what are you asking me? Because I still don't understand your question. And one of the problems is these terminologies that we use to explain about the Ottoman Plus are so deeply rooted in the English medium, in the way that Western society sees itself, in the way that Western society projects itself upon the rest of the world, that we've internalized this language, and then we're using it upon ourselves to some degree. It's not helpful. Okay, so this is why I understand why Marshall Hodgson then came out with this word Islamicate. Because like you go into an Ottoman mosque, Iznik tiling, and you know, people say, yes, Muslims did that. Well, actually it came from China. Okay, we took it from the Chinese. And then we adapted it. That's why he called it Islamicate. And I took my friend to Yildiz Jami, the mosque of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. It's the last mosque in Istanbul. And my friend goes, this looks very European. I said, but it's got Moorish styles. The Moorish styles are from Andalusia. He goes, yes, but it looks like a church. I said, why does it look like a church to you? Don't you see the dome? I said, okay, and what about Fatih Jami? Does Fatih Jami not look like a church? No, that's a jami, that's a proper jami. I said, are you sure? Are you sure? He goes, yes. So what about the architect? The architect goes, yes, I know the Yildiz Jami, the architect is Armenian. See, he's not even Muslim. And I said, who's the architect of Fatih Jami? He goes, Muslim, of course. Are you sure? The architect of Fatih Jami was Greek. And Fatih Jami was built on the image of Hagia Sophia. That was a church. Okay? But what it means is that it's Islamicate because it became what we would call Islamized. The culture of Islam, it submitted to it, and it became normalized within Islamic society to the point that it became something which was reflective of what we represent, our worldview. It became reflective of our worldview. Okay? It came from the outside, we took the ilm, we made it part of our worldview, and out it went. In that sense, the difference between Fatih Jami and Yildiz Jami is zero. There's no difference. Now, the reason why this is important, I've said this before, is because if you look at Yildiz Jami, the possibility of having those type of jamis could have been possible in Turkey. They could have been. But then when the Turkish Republic was created, they didn't want the imaginations of the 19th and 20th century, as I'm going to talk about in the next few weeks. So they took that imagination away from us. So now when we build jamis, like Chamli Jami, we build it in the image of Fatih Jami. and Sulaymaniya Jami. That's the imagination we have. The imagination of the 19th, 20th century is gone, it's taken away from us. And even if you look at like Chamlija Jami, okay, like I don't know, the minarets are what? Some of the minarets are the dates of Manzikat, which is what, and Fatih's conquest of Istanbul. So 1453 and 1071. These are not even Hijri dates, these are colonial Western dates. So why have we built minarets on these colonial dates? Because that's the imagination, and we internalize that in that sense. And this is the problem in the way that we understood the ulama. Now, one of the things that I saw continuously in my work was pictures of the ulama everywhere. And one of the interesting things that I continuously see, and I want to explain to you, is this idea then that does the tradition have a transformative ability? Can it transform? Can it change? Of course it can. I'm Hanafi, okay? Just because I'm in Turkey, you've got to make that very clear to people. In Turkey, the first question they ask you, you're Muslim, are you married, and then are you Hanafi? It's in that order. One of the interesting things is the way that I practice Madhab Hanafi is not the same as Abu Hanifa. Of course it isn't. Things have changed since then, but it has to transform it. The tradition has the ability to transform. People, they've created this argument of taqleed on one hand and ijtihad on the other hand, as if they're total opposites. Taqleed is transformative. It needs to be. And if taqleed is transformative, then it's part of ijtihad, not independent from it in that context. You understand? And the point I'm trying to make for you then is that in this period, when we're looking at the ulama in the next 3 weeks, I'm going to explain to you how the ulama are transformative. The Majalle, when it was produced in 1876, was actually controversial. It was quite controversial. By 1910, Mustafa Sabri Effendi wants to extend the Majalle, a traditionalist. He's saying we should extend the Majalle into the criminal law code. Why is he doing that? What's happened? Because what you realize is that whenever one person's tajdeed is another person's bid'ah. That's just the way it works. Okay? With one person saying this is a renewal, this is an adjustment, another person will say this is an innovation. It's linguistics, it's how it works. The question is always though, how does it fit regarding the aqidah? That's the question, okay, in this sense. And the last point I'm going to make, and then I know there's a class after this, is technology. One of the interesting things about the modern period is the introduction of technology. And I think technology changes everything. Technology is the key here in terms of how we view ourselves in regards to the world. The printed press is the technology, okay, that changes things. When Muslims would have to have a typewriter, let's just say, remember, so I used to have a typewriter where I used to press like this and zip, which you guys don't do anymore, you're using your phones. But prior to that typewriter, the print press machine was like that big. It was huge, okay? Now Latin script, A, B, C, D, no problem. Arabic script, but in the beginning, but in the middle, but in the end. We're not looking, imagine how many, you've got like a huge machine like that. And so people say, we don't need this. Why are we going to have a machine like this when I can just write by my hand? We have a pen. It does the job. And the only thing that people were printing in those times was religious texts. Okay, religious texts was the main thing that they needed to print. And Muslims were saying, we're not going to print the Quran. I'll give you an example. The majority of the ulama believed that translating the Quran was haram. Okay, in the 19th century, the translation of the Quran was haram. I never found an opinion in the 19th century to say that translating the Quran was fine. 21st century, it changes. One, because of the influx of English translations of the Quran that are coming from India, the West, and so forth. And second thing, after the collapse of the Ottomans in particular, like in Turkey, for example, if we don't translate the Quran to Turkish, then people are not going to read the Quran. What are we going to do? We better translate it. Okay, so you can see now the adjustment is being made. The hat. I never saw a single picture of someone in the Ottoman period that didn't have a hat prior to the collapse of the Ottomans. What's interesting about the Turkish Republic and the hat law is this. The hat was banned. The hat isn't fard. The hijab was not banned. The hijab was just restricted in terms of going into public places in that context, but the hijab was fard. But people were dying for the hat. You're dying. I'm not going to take the hat off. No way, no chance. It's not going anywhere. If I take the hat off, blah, blah, blah, blah, blah. Because there was a particular concern. It was impacting directly, not just society, but the ulama class specifically. Okay? They were being stripped away from their uniforms. And this mattered. It mattered to them in that sense. Yes, it is true that when we look at the fez, when the fez was introduced by Mahmud II, it was perceived as being something which was modern, reform. But the fez was taken from Morocco, from Fez. They were wearing it. And what's intriguing is the reason why you wear a fez is so that when you pray, you can touch the floor with your hat on your head. It makes no difference. And if you have to kiss the hand of the Padishah, there's no problem, there's no beak, there's nothing stopping you in that context. And this became Islamicate. It became a differentiation between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. Across the Muslim world, they were wearing hats that looked like fezzes. That's how you knew how to distinguish someone. And so in some ways, people were critiquing the Ottomans for modernizing, but in reality what they did is they created a distinction. They still were maintaining that we belong to the Islamicate world. So if you go to Malaysia and Indonesia, the Songgot, which I really like that. They fold it and they can put it in their pocket. It's like like chopsticks, and they can just pull it out and put it back. It's a folding fez. It's unbelievable, folding fez. Because I have a fez at home, I have to hold it in my hand like this, and I don't know where to put it, right? But the Albanians they were wearing the pilis, the fez, the white one, a lot earlier than the red fez of the Ottomans. They had something already in their society in that context, right? And so one of the things you're going to see is this. So what I'm trying to help you understand is that the 19th century, the world is changing, but there's still a need to try to differentiate. So on the one hand, of course, there's going to be commonalities. You have to take the tech and so forth. But on the same token, the world is changing so fast. One of the interesting things that I noticed, I'm writing an article right now on the comparison between Japan and the Ottoman Empire, right? And it was really intriguing for me. The Japanese were sending people to Istanbul to see what Istanbul was doing. And the French and the British had this Japonisme, this concept of being fascinated by Japanese art. So if you see works of Van Gogh, if anyone's been to the Van Gogh Museum, you'll see that Van Gogh has done a whole section on Japanese art. He was fascinated by the Japanese art. The Ottomans also had one called Ottoman Japanese. And the Japanese were coming to meet Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And some of their artistic style can be seen in Yildiz Jami, in the mosque. And what's interesting is when the Japanese, a particular architect was doing work in Istanbul, he then went to Japan and started introducing those works and ideas to them. The point is that you need to understand, like when you're trying to make these sharp distinctions between in and out, it's not helpful, okay? And the thing about the Ottoman period, it's a blur. There's a lot of things that are blurry. Now, the last point, I said that before, but the ulama in Turkey are studied from the perspective of law. This is the problem, okay? When we study the ulama, we're actually studying law, the evolution of law itself. But as I told you, and the point I made very early on was this idea of them being a meta-institution. They're more than law, okay? And if you only judge the transformation of hukuk, or the transformation of the Sharia, or the emergence of the Nizamiya courts, then you only see one aspect of the ulama. And the assumption would be, if you looked at it from that perspective, from the perspective of fiqh, the assumption would be that some form of secularization is taking place. But if you looked at the ulama from every component of what they belong to, in regards to the Islamicate, you start to see something very different. It's a lot more complicated than that, okay? The watch, for example. I've said this on so many, the clock. The clock destroyed Muslim societies, absolutely destroyed them. Because prior to the clock, Muslims would say, I'll meet you after Salat al-Asr. No problem. Wave their way in, out they go. Now you had a machine, the device that told you, meet me at 5 o'clock. Start work at 9, finish at 5. That's the rule. The clock didn't only change the way we told the time, it changed our perception of time. Now how would the Muslims have known that? Just like Twitter. How would you have known that Twitter is so toxic it's going to destroy you? I have never seen anyone who's happy on Twitter. They're just miserable all the time. That's why I'm not on it. Instagram makes you miserable. You're continuously trying to see the happiness of other people. It makes you miserable. Do you need to see so much? Do you need to know so much? No, you don't. But did you know that when it first came out? Of course you didn't. What's interesting is insan has a need to create Jannah on this dunya. We don't believe in Jannah in the West, right? But they believe in it because they create it on Instagram so that you can see it, because you need it as belief. They can't deny it, it's part of your fitrah, okay? So one of the things that I want you to understand is, we're going to talk about this later, about technology. Why the ulama were making particular decisions regarding technology. And one of the reasons could be, is that when technology came in, they looked at the tech and they said, it doesn't disagree with the aqidah. The clock doesn't disagree with the aqidah, so we can have the clock. And what's the ilm behind the clock? Well, it's part components, we tell the time. And so they introduced it to their worldview. What they didn't realize is that it was coming from a different aqidah, actually. It was coming from another aqidah in the sense that there was a worldview, a colonial worldview, which was driving the world to systemize them, to put them in blocks, to put them in places, to put them in lines, to put them in queues, come here, leave then, and so forth. But they didn't see the tech in that sense. Maybe to some degree it's because of how they understood aqidah in that sense. And that's something that we need to think about. Why Halak talks about this all the time. That technology is never neutral. Technology comes from a worldview, right? In that sense. Maybe here we could critique the Ottomans, that they weren't inventing some of this technology. But you can't blame them for embracing the technology, okay? When the British had the trains, they built trains from India to go up and down to move the slaves. They built trains so that they can take soldiers up and down India. That's why we had trains. It was not because they cared about people. But when the Ottomans built trains from Islam, they said, we'll build trains because people can go on the Hajj. That's how they saw the tech, okay? And so forth. All right, so I'm going to leave it there because I can see people are sleeping. I can see you all, by the way. I'm on this giant desk. Okay, so don't worry about it. It's hot. There's no oxygen. I know. It's tiring. I understand. And we've just eaten, and we've just come over. And then I don't have my whiteboard. Usually I have a whiteboard and I'm doing stuff. But they gave me a laptop. They put me here. All right. But the point I'm making today, or the idea behind what I'm trying to teach you today, is today I was just trying to set a conceptual framework. Okay? Because as I said to you before, I feel like still for you guys right now as young people, and you're a lot younger than me in that sense, that the idea of the ulama is something which is still disconnected in the imagination of what it means to be part of this class. The idea of having the ulama as a meta-institution is still missing in that sense because people can't grasp what it means to have an institution that's deeply ingrained in every aspect of state and society. The idea of modernity still needs a better conversation in regards to how we understand modernity in that sense. Because while we use it, for example, I wrote a paper where I said Mustafa Sabri Effendi was modern, but was not a modernist. Because I had to try to make a claim here. He wasn't, because the idea is if you're not modern, you're backwards. Right? If I gave you the question, can Islam be modern? It's a trick question. Of course, because if you say if Islam can be, you either say yes, it can be modern, or you say no, it's haram, it's kufr. You're on one side or the other. But in reality, what am I asking you if I'm saying can Islam be modern? Islam should not be paired up in this way. It should stand independent, okay, in that context, in that sense. So I want you to start thinking about what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about modernity. Because when we're talking about decoloniality, modernity is not going anywhere. The residue of modernity will still be here because the residue doesn't leave you. The Mongol invasion, the residue of the Mongol invasion stayed in the Ottomans. The residue of Hinduism is still in Muslims in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Okay? The residue of pre-Arabian society was still in the Muslims after Rasulullah came because we're civilizational builders. We're not civilizational destroyers. So in that sense, the negotiation with modernity is necessary in terms of what does it mean when we're talking about modernity. What I'm asking you then is aqidah, ilm, deen, siyasa. Okay? Where do you fit modernity regarding this? All right? And where do you place it? And I'm trying to deliberately give this to you from an Islamic perspective. I'm trying to deliberately not be a Western academic, even though I am one of those. So, because I think it's important that you start to think in your own language. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for being patient with me today. And do you have any questions? No. Yes, go ahead. So next week we will talk about the introduction of the Gulhane Edict. And the Gulhane Edict is interesting because it's the shift from what we call the pre-modern period to the modern period in terms of the Tanzimat, the introduction of military reform, political reform, and reformation. And the ulama, in that part of the narrative, are often seen as being secondary. But in reality, they are intrinsic to this reformation, especially Naqshbandis in that sense. A lot of people don't realize that. And it's also important because in today, when we talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Crimea, it was similar at the time of Russia's invasion of the Crimean Khanate, where a lot of the Muslims who were from the Russian state came to Istanbul and were technocrats who were pushing this transformation, this reformation, as a way of surviving the Russians. So we'll look at that. Then the week after that, we'll look at constitutionalism in particular, which is my area of speciality, and looking at law and constitutional majelle. And then week 4, we'll talk about actually the removal of the ulama in the Turkish Republic, because that's important to understand. I think that trauma we don't appreciate, how they were gutted up. And that level is phenomenal. And the reason why that could be important is because maybe not on the same scale, but things like that are still happening today, especially in certain states like Saudi and Syria and so forth. So it's sometimes important to look back in the past, not to learn from the mistakes. I mean, I'm tired of telling Muslims to keep learning from mistakes. We didn't only make mistakes, but it's what did we do well, what worked, and so on. So those will be the next 3 weeks in that sense. So, yeah, I agree. And I'll be honest with you, like I couldn't find a translation for deen. This is why I told you when I wrote these translations, they're not helpful. So I give an example. In the Quran, when Allah Ta'ala says, Lakum deenukum waliya deen, the Quraysh, what deen do they have? There's no religion they have. It's adat, it's traditions, it's behaviors. The Quraysh had a particular, they were polytheists, but they're henotheists. They had a particular form of practicing polytheism, but it wasn't restricted to a dogma or doctrine. They had no book in that sense. So deen here can mean secularism, if we use it in its general sense. Deen can mean Christianity, and deen can be just traditions and habits and behaviors that people subscribe to. So here, the problem is I could call deen religion, but then when Allah says in the Quran, Maliki yawmiddin, like what are we told, the day of religion? What does he mean here? So the word deen, and we take the word medaniyat from the word deen as being, once again, civilization is a European word. The civilization is not helpful to understand medaniyat also. So I accept it. Like worldview is not, I could have used the word ideology or religion. They're interchangeable. But this is why these words for me are what I would say untranslatables. We translate them because I'm speaking in this language. But I want you to understand them in its language. So that at least these words are far bigger than what these words, the English are restricting them to. I think this is part of the problem. So yeah, I agree with your point. Anything else? No. We're tired. We want to go. It's 5. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, people. It's good to see the familiar faces, and it's nice to see some new faces. Inshallah, I'll see you next week, if you can be bothered. But we've got 3 more weeks to go, okay? So look after yourself. Stay safe. We still have COVID, even though the Russians have invaded Ukraine. It hasn't ended, even though we don't need to wear masks. Okay, so just be careful. All right. Assalamu alaikum.